So what we're hoping to cover in the next sort of 45 minutes is this, folks. We want to think about the current overview of government policy and policy direction for SEND. We want to look at some of the early bits of evidence that signal a change in DfE's approach to the management, if you like, of SEND right at the heart of Whitehall. And we also need to think about how well we can articulate the scale of the task ahead, because boy, is it a big one. So next slide, please, Chris. Oh, what I would really encourage you to think about as well is that when you get access to the slide pack, which you can have access to everything that's on screen now and everything I'm going to share with you, including any notes. So there's a series of notes that sits behind or below each of the slides. That's for yours to take away, go and share with leadership, school governors, trustees, if you're based in a school, and maybe provide some time really to reflect on how government policy direction has implications for your local operations of SEND and what this might mean for your school, your trust, your pupil cohort, your families. And so do feel able to take this information, make it your own, and share it with, say, your local SENCO network, your school partnerships. So change, that was the real message, wasn't it, from Labour in the run up to the general election, their Labour Party manifesto and their key descriptor about their approach to move into government. And I think when you look behind that particular message of change, they described their key missions. So if any of you can remember back to them talking about how these missions would materialize, and one of them was about breaking down the barriers to opportunity. And I think when we see some of the ambitions around their original manifesto, boosting child development, for example, with 500,000 more children hitting the early learning goals by 2030, for example, seeing a sustained rise in young people's school outcomes over the next decade, building young people's life skills, we can immediately have a sense of where the direction of travel is likely to take us under this change manifesto mission. Some of the quotes on the screen there are actually lifted from the Big Ask survey that took place last year, that is led by the Office of the Children's Commissioner. So Dame Rachel D'Souza ran this survey, and there was a particular focus on pupils with SEND in the survey, and she has become increasingly more vocal, and rightly so, around, once we had the new government in place in July, then it was an opportunity to share the Office for Children's Commissioner's view on what we needed to focus our efforts on within the arena that we call SEND. But children in that survey, interestingly, and I would urge you to, if you've got the chance and the opportunity, and importantly the time, go and dig that out on the on the Office of Children's Commissioner's website, because the children that were surveyed were really clear about what they wanted. They wanted to be understood, seen, and heard, and they also wanted to benefit from a fantastic, ambitious education in mainstream school where possible, and support at school where and when they needed it, and for all activities and services to be accessible to them. Now, I don't think that's actually a significant ask. I don't think that's actually too ambitious an ask, but it worries me when I hear about what children are reported as saying through a national survey about what they want, and then actually I find myself sitting in a large secondary school having quite a series of challenging conversations with the senior leadership within that particular school, where we're actually starting to talk about reasonable adjustments and why the legal duties around reasonable adjustments are a challenge for that school to meet. So something has shifted, something has really changed, I think, in the discussions that we're having around SEND, around accessibility, around inclusion. And that for me is a signal just how much those in schools, those working in local authorities are under an enormous level of challenge to meet this increasingly sort of inclusive ambition as a country that we want to try and tackle. Next slide, please, Chris. So the Labour Party manifesto stated that too often our education and care systems do not meet the needs of all children. And I think what's particularly interesting is this language about taking a community-wide approach, improving inclusivity and expertise in mainstream schools. Some might say these are glib phrases. The devil is in the detail often, isn't it? So how we define improving inclusivity and expertise in mainstream school is going to be particularly important in policy development, sort of moving ahead, and also ensuring that special schools cater to those with the most complex needs. And that's tricky too, isn't it? Because as a parent of and also a sibling of a young lady with a severe level of learning disability, I recognise some of the challenges for parents around levels of dissatisfaction that exists around the country in terms of the quality of that increasingly inclusive educational offer that is being developed in mainstream, and actually in many parts of the country being developed incredibly well and doing a brilliant job, often in some cases not exactly on a shoestring budget, but not that far away. So I think there's been some clouding over the years of the placement of children within our special school sector and the perceived protection that can often bring and reassurance can bring to parents and indeed to some heads that are working in the system too. So Labour clearly set out during the course of the general election that they believe in opportunity for everyone. They recognise the intersections where class and other characteristics meet. They really wanted to act. This is what they were telling us. Labour will act to ensure that the increased barriers to opportunity, and I'm quoting now from their manifesto, increased barriers to opportunity for women, Black, Asian and minority ethnic people, LGBT plus people and disabled people are broken down too. So this was the party of inclusion, if you like, that was being marketed through the general election and also the sharing of their manifesto promises. Next slide, please, Chris. So we know that poor mental health is a key barrier to learning, and that struggle to access the support has a massive hampering effect on our children and young people right from their early years. And one of the main ambitions within the Labour Party manifesto was around providing access to specialist mental health professionals in every school. Just excuse me. So that was around the breakfast clubs, improving behaviour in attendance and learning, and Labour funding and committing to funding free breakfast clubs in every primary school, accessible to all children, and supporting parents and carers through the cost of living crisis through the provision of breakfast clubs in every primary school, and also providing access to specialist mental health professionals in every school so that every young person had access to early support to address any particular issues and problems before they began to escalate and grow. So we get a real sense, even before the outcome of the general election is revealed to us on July the 5th this year, that we've got a party here that is really ambitious around inclusion, really ambitious for change in SEND, and really ambitious to try and actually level some of the playing fields that I are operating in. So there was a real sense, I think, of not just change, but also of hope. That was certainly how I was perceiving that, and I know a number of my colleagues were too. So we were, we were anticipating, hopefully, back in the early summer. Next slide, please, Chris. So, of course, how that manifested itself in terms of when Labour was came into power, into government, was that we saw that through the King's speech there was a series of references and also planned bills. And I've picked out this one particularly because this is around the English devolution bill. And I think this is important to pick up on because what he said in his speech, His Majesty said in his speech, was that legislation will be introduced to give new powers to metro mayors and combined authorities. This will support local growth plans that bring economic benefit to communities. Now, I think this is quite an interesting concept because with greater devolution, funding becomes even more critical for local authorities. And while devolution is a really positive step towards allowing local areas, local authorities, greater autonomy, greater financial independence and accountability, it can also mean an increased level of pressure to efficiently manage those revenue streams in what are already very challenging times for very many of us. So that for me, there's a tension here that whilst the legislation pertaining to children and young people with SEND remains unaffected by greater devolution, the requirement placed on local authorities, however, for increased financial accountability under devolution does seem odd when we know from the activity in the SEND landscape of provision and resource allocation is under acute scrutiny. So it'll be really interesting to see how this this concept of devolution sort of plays out and impacts on increased local financial accountability and the behaviours and attitudes of some local areas for SEND practices and improvements needed for some of their services too. So there's a bit of a watch this space for me on how the English devolution bill actually does play out and impacts on other strategic and operational areas for local authorities. Next slide, please, Chris. So among the 39 bills that were announced in the King's speech was the Children's Wellbeing Bill. And the bill aims to transform the life chances for the millions of children and young people in England by introducing new measures in the education and social care systems. And that includes a whole raft of new measures. So a children not in school register, for example, a legal requirement for schools to have a breakfast club, a limit on the number of school branded items schools can require as part of school uniform, enhanced powers for Ofsted, plans to make all schools follow the national curriculum, and so on. So I think, watching this promoting children's well-being bill is going to be an interesting space to do so. But importantly, there will be a distinct overlap into the area of SEND, particularly for children and young people where SEMH needs are particularly are of concern. Next slide, please, Chris. So is there a new plan for SEND on the back of all of this? Well, my conclusion is no, there isn't a new plan for SEND. I think July the 5th saw a new Labour government take up office, a changed Labour Party, now an administration of the UK, but will this bring about positive change for SEND? And on my assessment of what's happened to that point in the timeline, my answer is no. I'm happy to be, to be argued with and to consider other points of view. But I think as far as the intentions and plans for SEND from our new Secretary of State and Minister of State for Women and Equalities, Bridget Phillipson, I think the early indicators of change in the UK government's, the current UK government's take up of power I don't think they're particularly impressive. You know, I was really impressed at how quickly Labour got things moving once they were in place from January the 5th. So there are a number of changes that happened incredibly quickly within government, one of which I'll talk about shortly in relation to education and SEND. So no, sadly, at this point in the presentation, I can't report that actually there's a new plan for SEND and that the new government came in with a new plan for SEND, because all the evidence suggests that they didn't. Okay, and they truly didn't realise the extent of what they were taking on with regards to the SEND operation for government. I want to take a pause at that point, Chris, if that's okay, and then see if we've got any questions.
Let me just have a look, Jane. So, yeah, I've got a question here. I think there should be a national training scheme and a national network for heads of SEND and others in SEND roles in LAs. I've worked in schools in 2 different LAs with a number of heads of SEND, and they all work extraordinarily hard, but have quite different backgrounds and no common training. Is there a plan for national training for local authority SEND leaders? They oversee crucial provision for children and billions of pounds.
Yeah, great question. We did have an offer, a national offer through government. So it was DFE contracted with NDTI, the National Development Team for Inclusion, who provided a leadership for SEND offer. Now, the funding for that particular contract, I think, ended over a year ago. But what NDTI have continued to do, and largely through the, I think this is through linking up with some of the change programme partnerships that are operating across the 9 regions, is that the NDT DFE originally contracted offer for leadership for SEND is still active, is still available. So what I would suggest is that you go and have a look at the NDTI website, which is www.ndti.org.uk. So have a look at their leadership for SEND offer, because that was nationally provided and also funded by government. And of course, one of the biggies now is that, you know, we don't have sufficient funds in place to do what we know we need to do in some local areas across the country. And as a sadly, there is, you know, there's a real impact being felt really on the development, meeting the development needs of leadership locally. And I don't just mean local authority leaders, I also mean local leaders in our schools and in our settings as well. Any other questions, Chris, before we move on?
Yeah, there's a couple here, James, who says, I'll read one out. Should there not be a standard format for EHCPs and the assessment process so that there is consistency across authorities? Also standardised funding streams for each of the areas?
Well, again, that was one of the real ambitions, wasn't it, that came out of the SEND and Alternative Provision Improvement Plan from government. And of course, that was under the former administration. And later on in this presentation, I will give you a bit of an update on what the focus or what foci remains within those change programme partnerships around, you know, the direction of travel for them, because of course they're due to finish, they're due to end in August next year, which is not that far away, folks, as we all know. So time is a ticking, really. So and I don't believe that they will be able to continue having a focus on the development of the EHCP process, what the plan document looks like, and any digital notions sitting behind that. I think that possibly has been shelved for the time being. But yeah, I agree. There should be a national sort of concept of what a plan looks like. I think for me as a parent, again, I would think about, you know, what does that look like for my child, and how well does the plan reflect exactly what we need to know about my child and our family ambitions for his life, and how well local services can be organised in such a way to support us to achieving those ambitions. So I think there's something about, yes, having a national understanding of what an EHCP, what a good one looks like, but also not losing a sense of local opportunities for increased personalisation, individualisation. You know, so for me, there's somewhere in between that we need to walk. Okay, shall we move on then, Chris? Yeah. Thank you for your questions, folks. Great. So an overview of current policy direction for SEND since early July. So really interestingly, and I have to say I was delighted, a restructuring of place responsibility for SEND and AP has taken place within the DfE Schools Division. So it's come out of Children and Families, and it's been absolutely embedded within the Schools Division, which is brilliant, which is absolutely all means all approach. And Stephen Kinnock MP, Minister of State for the Department of Health and Social Care, also has SEND in his brief, and it's clearly stated. So it's really important that we recognise that this sort of infrastructure to how SEND is perceived, so thought about and therefore planned for, right in the heart of government, has really started off on a strong start. So I'm a real fan of that restructuring approach, and I haven't met anybody else that isn't a fan either. To move from feeling a bit of a bolt-on to being right in the heart of the Schools Division. And then Bridget Phillipson announced the headline Ofsted grades would be scrapped for schools with immediate effect, and then also the introduction of the new report cards, which will be coming in 2025. And I'll come on to talk about Ofsted a little bit later. And Ofsted will check the quality of school support for vulnerable pupils and the disadvantaged, and grade down those that turn away children with SEND under a new inclusion criterion in proposed report cards. Now, what that means in reality, so, because I'm not sure how we measure inclusion, I've got a number of ideas about that, and I'm sure you have too. But first, we've got to be really, really clear about what we define as inclusive, practice, and what does good inclusion look like? What does inclusion look like? And because for me, inclusion is not a resource-based issue. Inclusion is a human right, and yet I know operationally inclusion is becoming a resource-based issue, because resources need to follow children to successfully be educated within their local mainstream school, because that may mean some differences in the way in which the school supports children and young people with additional needs. And we also have to address the fact that this is not about demanding the changes that children and young people make. It's about how we as providers actually make the change that enables children and young people to be included into our space, into our mainstream worlds. I've just got a couple of notes here, which is I think in the past, thinking about that top point on this slide, responsibility sat for SEND in the Children and Families brief within the Department for Education, and I think that caused almost a high risk of sort of othering when it came to SEND policy, ironically almost mirroring the experience of SEND children, young people and families, as decisions around SEND were often, or too often, made in isolation from core education policy. So the change that is being described in that orange section on this slide here is a really positive step towards removing the silo approach in policy making for all children in education. So that definitely has my vote, folks. Next slide, please, Chris. So let's have a think about the curriculum and assessment review then. So what they're seeking to do here is to review the existing national curriculum and statutory assessment system in England to ensure that they're fit for purpose and meeting the needs of all children and young people. So again, I would encourage you all to click onto the gov.uk curriculum and assessment review page, where there are explanations and information about how you can not just give evidence during the curriculum and assessment review, but also access online and face-to-face sessions to explore more about the curriculum and assessment review, and also offer your particular points of view. So key outputs of that review is that, you know, government is looking for a curriculum that reflects the issues and diversities of our society, ensuring that all of our children and young people are represented, and that we also have in place an assessment system that captures the strengths of every child and young person and the breadth of a curriculum. So, and we know how tricky that is at the moment. We know that some of our children with SEND, who compared to their mainstream peers, will be way, way, way behind on one level when we come to analyse their progress and to assess their particular level of learning or level of progress. And often we see it through that sort of one lens. And I think what the curriculum assessment review, I hope, is aiming to do is to look at assessment in its broadest sense, so that we can hopefully move to much more of a strengths-based approach for all children, but particularly for children and young people who have learning differences and learn very differently to their peers. So again, it's going to be an interesting sort of watch this space, and it's Professor Becky Francis who's leading on that review. So do take a look at the gov.uk pages, and I would also encourage all of you to make sure that that review is sitting on your local office, so there is a link there for local folks, families, parents, carers, teachers, Senkos, heads, etc., to be able to access those web-based and face-to-face opportunities to discuss the review. Next slide, please, Chris. So I said I was going to talk about Ofsted a little bit later, and here it is. New focus on inclusion. And I think what we can now expect is a new inspection framework and much more scrutiny over how inclusive schools are, as part of the new sort of Ofsted evolution announced earlier in the term. So next September, we're going to have the introduction of a scorecard inspection report system. And we're expecting that to be introduced from September 25. And also Ofsted has announced that it's consulting on introducing a new inspection criteria for inclusion as part of its changes. And as I've said, I think that is fraught with challenge, but it's going to be interesting, and I think I'll share with you shortly the membership of the group that will be looking at that specifically. So next slide, please, Chris. So also within the Ofsted landscape, SEND area inspections are being reviewed again. It almost feels as though we've only just reviewed them. I think the new SEND area inspection framework was introduced only about 18 months ago, after a refresh and a review, but we're doing that again, it seems. So although Ofsted and CQC have been expecting area SEND services for over 8 years now, the inspection framework, which, as I say, was overhauled fairly recently, and it's still sort of fairly new, but at the time of writing this, there's only, I think it's less than 30% of local area partnerships have been inspected under the new framework. And it will now then go and review its system of SEND area inspections undertaken with CQC's Care Quality Commission again. So there's something, you know, for me that feels a little bit Groundhog Day-ish around this, because Ofsted haven't explained why it thinks the current area SEND inspection framework isn't doing that job well enough. So, you know, there's something amiss here, and it's yet to be explained thoroughly. I think the most important immediate consequence is that Ofsted and CQC have paused a crucial part of the current area SEND inspection process, and that's monitoring visits. And the area SEND inspection framework is so new that there haven't been any monitoring visits yet. So the first monitoring visit that was due was for this autumn, this time of year, but won't be happening now because, of course, they've put a pause on those. So they are responding to the massive survey, the Big Listen, that closed back in the summer. And what was interesting was that Ofsted said in relation to local area inspections that some respondents in the Big Listen want us to stop inspecting SEND services across a local area. And that was largely because they felt that it was too broken. You know, the local system simply was too broken. So next slide, please, Chris. So why have I got a swallow on screen? Well, one swallow does not a summer make. We might be focused on inclusion, and the current discussions and conversations around new government is about the increased focus on inclusion. But that doesn't necessarily mean that government and Ofsted, CQC are an indication of the wider part of the improvement plan for SEND. So that new model should have a strong focus on provision and progress for pupils with SEND, such as standards around the strategic role of the SENCO, inclusive admissions, curriculum accessibility, extracurricular provision, and thinking about, what an accessible curriculum offer looks like that is that's of high value, that's externally validated, and that can sit alongside some of our GCSE pathways and offers, and indeed complement some of it too. So I think it's really clear that if the improvements to provision laid out in the SEND app improvement plan are to come to pass, then disincentives to inclusion must first be addressed. And that's surely going to be easier to achieve when the same team is responsible for both school policy and equitable provision. So that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a bit of a shift in the thinking from government that says, okay, we've got to tackle the disincentives to include some of our children within the wider offer for mainstream. And we can do that now because actually we've got the needs of children with SEND deeply embedded within the schools division within DFE. Right, Chris, I'm going to take another quick break there, but I'm also really conscious of time. Sorry, can you just skip on to the next slide? Because I think that will help. So is there a new plan for SEND at this point in the process? I report no, sadly. Okay, so any questions, any quick questions here, folks, because I'm going to hop, skip and jump through the rest of the presentation so you can all get away by 10. Any questions there, Chris?
So, Miles, do you have any at your end?
Sorry, I was on mute then. What do you expect will happen re-safety valve?
Right, can I pick that question up a little bit later? Because there's a couple of specific points that I make about the efficacy of the safety valve programme a little bit later down the road. Is that okay?
Yep, I'll see if I can find another one. 2 seconds.
Fab. So one more question and then we'll move on. I love that question. Hi, Jane. Has DFE got good people advising? Well, one would like to think so. I mean, we have got a leadership board for the SEND Up improvement plan. There is very little that is reported into the public domain that comes from that leadership board, which always, makes a few little bells go off in my mind when I think actually this is a publicly funded board looking at publicly funded areas of policy for SEND. So what does the conversation look like? and how our representatives from whichever part of the sector in SEND are coming from, how well are our views being represented by who sits on the board. So I would like to think that they're getting good advice. I always worry and I'm concerned that the voices of children, young people, parents, carers and families get lost a little bit in translation, and they're not necessarily thought as the first group of stakeholders to engage with. We're often sort of still added on right at the bottom of the list, or a little bit of an afterthought at times. So I think this whole notion of being really signed up to co-production, you know, that, and co-production takes a hell of a lot of work and quite a long time to achieve if you're going to do it properly. So so again, I think, you know, where do the values of co-production sit within that that leadership board for the Send Up improvement plan? Okay, are we happy to move on? Yeah, some parental voices are louder. Yes, yeah, no, I agree. I agree. Okay, we're going to move on then. Chris, so next slide, please. So quick squit. So I've just highlighted on the slide here in green, key members of the DfE ministerial team. Okay, so you've got Catherine McKinnell, Schools Minister, and then what follows each of the names is essentially what their ministerial brief contains. So the areas of responsibility. But what is coming across loud and clear is that every policy is a SEND policy, essentially. We're now at the point where 1 in 5 in every classroom in England has an identified need. So this is not a niche issue that can be worked out in silos. It has to be central to every policy area in education. So we need SEND to be considered intrinsic to attendance, behaviour, assessment, curriculum, mental health. Inclusion means considering all children in every decision we make about education. So that's what we want, and that's what I'm looking for from the DfE ministerial team and their respective scope of their briefs. Next slide, please, Chris. Just wanted to flag up the what works in SEND. I'm not sure whether you've heard of this. I've given you the website link in the top left hand corner there. It's a program that's part of a program of work led by the RISE partnership, bringing together thought leaders from the SEND system who have the necessary understanding of system change and specialist knowledge of SEND. Launched back in October 2022. What works in SEND is really quite ambitious in thinking about learning, innovation, and it's designed to generate high quality evidence of what works at system level in SEND to improve outcomes for children, young people and families. So do take a look at that. Next slide, please. So in earlier this year, the general election led to a period of government shutdown, a period of purdah, which allowed the change process for the change programme partnerships. So these are these 9 regional SENDAP focused partnerships, and I suppose what it did is it slowed down some of that period of planned change within each of those regions because of the government shutdown leading to the general election. So I think there's something about that all of those change programme partnerships now find themselves in a slightly different position under the new government compared to its predecessor. So but overall, their job is to ensure that part of that change process imperative is about the need to implement the current legislation of the Children and Families Act Part 3. So and because actually I believe that the legislation doesn't require an awful lot of change, if I'm honest. You know, I think we've got a sound legislative framework. I think the real difficulty has been over the time since 2014 when the the then new legislative framework for SEND was implemented, is about how well that was implemented across the country. So there was an inconsistency around how well we undertook the implementation of change at that time. And I think local authorities were driven by government targets to, make the transition from statements to plans in, a certain number of months. I think there was about a two-year sort of timeline, I think, for that. So there were targets around that. There were targets around how do we actually make the change into the education, health and care plan format, and then obviously adopt the new 20-week time frame. So I think we became slightly over obsessed with all of those target-driven activities, which were necessary, but actually shouldn't necessarily have been prioritized first and foremost over the really important work of ensuring that we brought everybody forward, more or less together. And that for me was about relational change, and that really didn't take place as well as we would have liked. So change program partnerships funded from 2023 to 25. They're testing certain aspects of the SEND app improvement plan. And then, of course, they'll articulate the statutory changes required to implement change for long-term reform of the SEND system from 25 plus. So next slide, please, Chris. Let's have a little look at this. So what we need to remember is that whilst we've got these 9 regional partnerships, change partnerships operating around the country, the focus, of course, is operating within this sort of really challenging sort of context. So we know that SEND is a priority. We don't want to be thought of as an afterthought or dealt with as a bolt-on. But also we know that we've got to enable all of our school services and settings to make identification of emerging needs and early intervention a reality for all, rather than the statutory end of the system really sort of dealing with all of the issues relating to SEND. So for our children, young people and families at local level, we have to improve and extend the training opportunities on SEND for professionals and families. And I can't tell you that the number of projects, the amount of money that I've managed on behalf of other organisations over the years that have had this main ambition of improving and extending training opportunities on SEND for professionals and families. We have an absolute mass of content materials. I know because I've written an awful lot of it and delivered a lot of it, but it exists at I will come on to the DBV programme. I haven't forgotten, but we've got to make sure that we've got our fingers on the tabs in terms of what is available. And the vast majority of what I'm describing is available free of charge. So mostly I would point people to the SEND Gateway. I would point people to the What Works for SEND programme that I referred to just a few minutes ago in terms of looking at where you can access some of those training opportunities. And if you're stuck, just please drop me a line. All right, happy to direct you to wherever you need to go. But fundamentally, we've got to address the council's special needs deficits, which are currently kept off their balance sheets, and that the Tory government kicked that can down the road to about 2026. I think it is March 2026. What's Labour going to do? Is the new Labour government going to kick that down the road to 2028? We don't know, but certainly, in my view, those special needs deficits need to be written off, and I absolutely know that government simply will not be able to do that. And then Ofsted reform, we talked about the report card model and strengthening accountability for SEND on a number of levels. Next slide, please, Chris. So making SEND a priority and not an afterthought. So the restructuring to place responsibility for SEND and AP within the schools group, great start. Ensuring, however, that the team in DFE have sufficient knowledge and skills within the schools group to implement an all means all approach to policy and the preparation that goes into policy is really, really important, because those guys that have been working in the children and families team or division with the Send app agenda may well have moved into the schools division, but it's the shakedown effect of that and the sharing of the responsibilities across the whole of the schools division that worries me a little bit about whether everybody's prepped and in place for that. Labour's said very little about what it will do. Its manifesto pledge around community-wide approach to SEND, improving inclusivity and expertise in mainstream schools. You know, we need to actually see the detail of this and what that actually means for children and families, and we've yet to see that. We don't need any tinkering, okay? What we need is systemic change and financial sustainability solutions. And that is going to take a lot of work, and it's also going to take quite a lot of additional funds to get us to that point. Next slide, please. So making identification of emerging needs and early intervention a reality for all. We've got to refresh, we've got to review and refresh the SEND notional funding formula and allocation for schools, because it's just simply not been looked at, you know, for donkey's years. And similarly, the place value for special schools currently sitting at 10k. There's been no change for the last 10 years to that. And of course, we know that the costs per place have increased exponentially. And we've got to revise local high needs funding arrangements focused on the emerging needs of pupils, which enable schools to give pupils what they need quickly. So access to additional resources for schools at the point of identifying when the needs of children begin to increase, or even just before that, has to be absolutely the right way forward. And I think this is where it links back to the community-based modelling that Labour referred to back in their manifesto during the general election. This idea of a community-based model, we've seen some really interesting work and really effective work around school clusters, cluster partnerships between local authorities and local schools, managing a delegated range of funds that can be attributed and allocated directly into schools based on their SEND needs. Okay, next slide, please. Sorry, folks, we've sort of overrun a little bit, haven't we? Next slide, please. So just talked about the community-based approach, you know, that's emerging from DFE as the preferred option. We're reliant on local authorities and ICBs working much more closely together. So a real focus, strengthening of joint commissioning of services and supports for SEND. And maybe this idea of SEND alliances. So next slide, please, Chris. And I've pinched this from Amanda Allard, who's Director of Council for Disabled Children. I know Amanda won't be upset about that because she wants people to see this. But if you just have a little look at this briefly, this is the delivery and ICB clinical oversight model. And I particularly like this idea in the circle there, the reddy pink section of the circle, where the SEND Alliance, so that's the ICB and the local authority working together to hold delegated responsibility for the total allocation for SEND for the local area, and commissions SEND services, including setting support together. So really, I like this model, and I think we could develop this. Okay, next slide, please. And then, of course, we've got to make sure that whatever local need we've got, can we match that with the capability and capacity of our local workforce? So skill level, knowledge level, execution level of putting those skills and those practices into place to really make a difference in better meeting need. So I think that's really important. Next slide, please. And addressing council's special needs deficits. DFE doesn't believe that they can write off the SEND deficit. They don't. I think the options might be that they kick the can a little bit further down the road, or, you know, there might be some amelioration measures applied to offer a small reduction to overall deficits. But, you know, next Wednesday is going to prove that, isn't it? Budget day. The outcome of CPPs, of the Change Partnership Programmes. I know there's been a comment, you know, we haven't heard much about what's going on, and you're right, we haven't heard enough about what's going on. And if it's extended by a further year, which I believe DFE have gone to the Treasury to ask to do that, then that will be interesting to see how that plays out in the development of their agenda for change. but also against the backdrop that there simply isn't any new money. So I wouldn't expect that the timeline would extend and more millions would go into the Change Partnership programme. Next slide, please. So Ofsted Reform Inclusion External Reference Group, I mentioned that these are the members here, so become familiar with those. So the co-chairs are Mark Vickers and Lee Alston from Ofsted, and Mark obviously from Olive Academies. Next slide, please. So what next? So we know that DfE is requested an extension to the Change Partnerships, and we'll have to wait and see until next Wednesday as whether, what the Treasury's response has been to that. CPP, so Change Partnership programs have been advised to focus by DfE upon LSEC, so that's the early language screening and practice, the inclusive mainstream practice offer and AP particularly, and a key focus on inclusion and local area inclusion plans. And for those of you that may well have been part of the DBV programme, the local area inclusion plan quite simply is based on phase 1 of DBV from what it looks like. So for those of you that have been involved in DBV, it won't be a massive departure from what you've known and experienced through the phase 1 DBV process. So watch this space, folks. And next slide, please. Schools Week, only, I think it was either yesterday or the day before, they were reporting on the 4 key priorities that were set to really focus the mind of government, and they're on the screen there. And more recently, only this morning, the initial press releases around the expected National Audit Office report on on SEND. I'm just having a look at that. So just to ensure that I've given you. Yeah, so the National Audit Office warned today that the special needs system is financially unsustainable, with 2/5 of councils at risk of declaring bankruptcy by March 2026 over spiralling costs on special needs. So, pretty grim stuff, folks, but for those of you that are working in local areas and for local councils, you know that better than anyone. Next slide, please. Is there a new plan for SEND? Well, no, I have to report, but maybe it's a no, not yet, because I think, to be fair, there's been some bold restructuring right at the beginning of the term, and we've not really heard much else from government in terms of the SEND agenda. And I think that's largely because whatever changes they want to implement, they've had to go to the Treasury to ask for permission to do it. So for me, this isn't about questioning their intent. I think it's actually questioning the means, really, and whether government has access to the means to follow through on their intent for a new plan for SEND. So watch this space, folks. Thanks for listening, everybody. The next slide, the final slide, I believe, is my contact details. So do make a note of that if you just want to have a chat. I hope that's given you a little bit of a roundup, really, on where we're heading. It doesn't feel that clear, and that's genuinely because it's not that clear. So I hope you felt that's a fairly honest account of the direction of travel for the time being. But it's been great having you with us this morning. Many thanks.